few questions. Okay, now I'm glad to present our third speaker. Dr. habilitated Péter Szabó. Now he's full professor at the Postgraduate Institute of Canon Law in Budapest, also professor of canon law at the St. Athanasius Institute in Nyíregyháza, invited professor at the Pontifical Oriental Institute and the Faculty of Canon Law at St. Pius X Institute in Venice. Dr. Péter Szabó received his doctorate in theology from the Pázmány Péter Catholic Academy of Theology in Budapest and PhD in 97. He also obtained the doctorate in canon law from the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome in 1996. From 1995 to taught canon law at the Greek Catholic Theology Department of Nyíregyháza College of the University of Nyíregyháza. Since 2000, he has been in charge of the subject and monitors the teaching in the department. In 1996, after obtaining his doctorate in canon law, he has supported to teach canon law at St. Athanasius Greek Catholic College of Theology. And at the same time, he was invited to teach at the Institute of Canon Law in the Pázmány Péter Catholic University. Now he's working full-time at the university and lecturer of those two institutions and part-time in the Venice Institute and the Pontifical Oriental Institute. His topic will be for a more Eastern-inspired ecclesiological model, comments along the topics of the conference concept. Please, dear professor, the floor is yours. You may take the floor. It's up to you.
Thanks.
I have to do everything step by step. What should I do now?
Now we wait for resolution of some technical issues.
Share the picture. I must go to this stick and then find it there to hold one and so. You can just tell me next one and then I'll start.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, the title of my presentation for a more Eastern-inspired ecclesiological model. Thank you. For a more Eastern-inspired ecclesiological model, comments on the topics of the conference concept. Instead of analyzing a specific topic, in this presentation, I will try to comment on several issues raised by the general title of our conference, with the hope that these thoughts might contribute to a more accurate understanding of the related problems that have emerged. In the light of the final program, I slightly modified the topics discussed. Since there were more than one interesting lecture yesterday on the Patron office, today I will only briefly touch this important issue, while more time I am going to dedicate to the Latin-Eastern relationship, a decision which is also motivated by the experiences of the last few weeks. The second slide, please, Thomas. I will briefly discuss
It somehow doesn't work.
Yes, thank you. I will briefly discuss the following topics. One, Eastern churches, their new ecclesiological identity and their position in the Catholic Communion. The second topic, ways to develop a mutual understanding between the Latin and Eastern Catholic churches. And finally, how can we try to promote Orthodox Eastern Catholic dialogue? Due to the shortness of time, I will immediately get into the first topic, the third slide, please. Next one, yes, thanks. Eastern Catholic churches, their ecclesiological identity and their exact juridical position in the Communio Ecclesiarum. The fourth one, please. According to one of the statements of our conference concept, I quote, the Eastern Catholic churches are often regarded by the Orthodox as a mere ritual version of the Latin Catholicism, and their often submissive role within the Catholic community disqualifies them from being considered as a model for eventual unity. End of the quotation. I have been writing about ecclesiological and juridical identity of the Eastern churches for almost 30 years, and certainly not only me. The issue may seem a bit boring and repetitive, but we are forced by compelling circumstances to put on the agenda again and again this topic, because the Eastern Catholic churches are still surrounded by severe ignorance and misunderstanding, with all due respect to the exception that exists. Although the conciliar doctrine and expectation in this area are clear, their full reception is still waiting to be seen. Interestingly, not only from the Latin, but also from the Eastern Catholic side, albeit from a different aspect. Ecclesiological nature and juridical position of the Eastern Catholic churches. The Second Vatican Council's image of the Church and the Second Eastern Codification, as we know, in this field has brought about a radical change. The fifth slide, please. Although Church sui juris until now is interpreted by some authors as a simply sociological phenomenon, it is the opinion among others of David Maria Jaeger, Franciscan canon lawyer from Rome, only a sociological phenomenon, their true ecclesiological nature is increasingly obvious. In this regard, I would like to recall an insightful observation by Gianfranco Ghirlanda, the sixth one, please. Ultimately, even the patriarchal church and also the other churches sui juris can be considered ecclesiae in the theological sense. Actually, according to him, according to Ghirlanda, I quote, a portion of the people of God is to be considered as a church when it is formed in the image of the universal church, that is, when all the elements essential to the very nature of the church and some specific elements are found in it, such as a particular portion of the people of God, the right, the territory, the governing bodies. End of quotation. As the author himself states, the different aspects of the Church of Christ, which is in fact presents itself as particular sui juris or universal, are specified by two elements. The first is the portion of the people of God, while the second is a governmental structure which in itself is essential to the nature of the church, but At the same time, also an accidental element of specification. In short, the Catholic Church can be understood as a communion of churches sui juris. The seventh, please. And what is more, this approach, far from being detrimental to the Catholic self-understanding, is rather beneficial. In fact, as it is emphasized by Hermann Pottmeyer, a communion among the churches can only succeed if it is regionally organized. In this sense, the local cohesion generated among eparchies by superior authorities of the churches sui juris builds and strengthens the intrinsic unity of the church as a whole. The eighth one, please. Juridical feature and collocation of the churches sui juris. The equality of churches sui juris is primarily manifested in the fact that they are completely independent from each other and all are immediately subjected to the Apostolic See. It is enough to quote here two eloquent statements in this regard. Ivan Zsuzsak, the former secretary of the Oriental Codification, I quote, "The Eastern Catholic churches as sui juris are hierarchically independent of one another, although all are subjected to the Supreme Pontiff." End of quotation. And then another quotation from the Encyclopedia del Diritto, the Ronzani, I quote, "No particular church or church sui juris is governed by another church sui juris, and the Holy See has no relations with one through another." The ninth, please. Yes. The very same understanding is reinforced by the express utterances of Eastern Codification. I quote, "The Metropolitan Church sui juris as an ecclesia sui juris depends solely on the supreme authority of the Universal Church. And furthermore, metropolitan churches are directly subject to the Roman Pontiff only." The 10th, please. In the light of this immediate relation, we can understand the insightful observation of Infidaimas, according to whom, I quote, "Eastern churches sui juris are taxonomically placed on the same level as the entire Latin Church, End of quotation. Along these lines, churches sui juris, Easterns and Latin, are set side by side, irrespective of their membership size, antiquity, or momentary hierarchical status. It is necessary to draw attention again and again to these two essential features: the true ecclesiastical nature on the one hand, and the mutual independence of the churches sui juris on the other hand, as the experience of the reception of these essential theses shows shortcomings and sometimes even opposition. The next one, please, 11. It should be noted that anyone who disputes these two essential features of the Eastern churches, the ecclesiastical nature and the horizontal juridical independence, not only finds oneself in conflict with the conciliar ecclesiology and the Eastern codification, but also creates an insurmountable obstacle to the future of the ecumenical dialogue. In fact, if the church sui juris is not ecclesiological in nature, then the sister churches are not true churches either. Why while renewed doubts about the thesis of the mutual horizontal independence imply the possibility of jurisdictional subordination of a whole Eastern Church to Latin local authorities, reminiscent of the Crusades. Such an absurd hypothesis, even if it were a merely theoretical possibility, would seriously set back the Catholic-Orthodox dialogue. The immediate subordination of the Eastern churches to the Apostolic See doesn't rule out the possibility that more or less small scattered communities, but never a complete church sui juris, be entrusted to a local hierarch of a different church. This is also exactly the case with the ordinariate of Byzantine Rite Catholics in Austria. In what direction should this autonomy continue to develop? The answer to this question of the conference concept is multiform. In addition to the hierarchical elevation, which is a conspicuous method of increasing autonomy, many other smaller but no less relevant steps are also possible, depending on the parameters of the given church sui juris. Thus, for example, following the ancient Cypriot model, it would be conceivable that, like the patriarchs, the election of the matriarch would not require papal confirmation, a step that would also have an obvious ecumenical advantage. In addition to the structural issues above, the desired overcoming of our qualification as a mere ritual version of Latin Catholicism requires efforts in the field of the doctrinal self-identity as well. In fact, in addition to the disciplinary variety, the last ecumenical council, as we know, also advocated the rediscovery of one's proper theological heritage. Such a renewal has a threefold objective: a service for the entire Church to express and live her Catholicity as unity in diversity in a proper and fully manner, as the first aim, a greater self-esteem for the interested Eastern communities that comes from the rediscovery of their own heritage as a true treasure, and finally, as a third aim, ecumenical convergence. The theological pluriformity inside the Catholic Church will not be a consequence of unity with the Orthodox, but most likely a prerequisite of it. 60 years after the Council, we are still at the beginning of this journey of rediscovery, a fact which is hard to dispute if we take into consideration that the theological formation of Eastern Catholic elite, endowed with greater prestige, is still taking place in the Latin faculties, where they rarely have the opportunity to learn of the Eastern approach and content of their studies and formation. The 12th slide, please. Ways to develop the mutual understanding between the Latin and the Eastern Catholic churches, the second topic. The first and indispensable prerequisite or step for mutual understanding, as it is obvious, is the precise identification of the problems, a comprehensive and common understanding of them. This aim requires a truly synodal attitude, listening and dialogue to understand the topic and the intention of the interlocutor. This method, and only this one, excludes the risk of the said but not real phenomenon to refuse a proposal before or without being exactly understood it. One of the long unsolved issues of Latin-Eastern relations is the extension of the patriarchal jurisdiction to the scattered Eastern communities emigrated into the West. We shall have another presentation of this topic by Professor Laschuk. I have to admit that I am not coming from this contest, so my reflection will be rather technical and juridical, and I am really very interested the conference of my colleague on the same topic, which will be much more radicated in the reality, surely. This next slide, please. An important observation, the next one. One more, please. Yes, an important observation. I believe that the request for territorial extension will be always rejected as long as universal personal jurisdiction will be demanded, and for at least 3 reasons. First, the Eastern patriarchs never had such a type of power. Second, this solution would create the impression that the patriarchal authority was somehow equated with that of the Roman pontiff, whose unique attribute is universal jurisdiction. And finally, if the patriarch were the local hierarch or his faithful without a proper eparch all over the world, practical interritual difficulties could arise wherever he might need the service of Latin pastors to provide for their faithful. In my view, it would be a more appropriate instead to formulate a demand more modest but difficult to refuse, which moreover has already been proposed by renowned authors. I mean, as a first step, it would be better to request the extension of the patriarchal jurisdiction only to those areas of the West where Eastern eparchies have already been established, or rather only to some smaller areas or enclaves of them. In this hypothesis, actually, the Latin-Eastern relationship wouldn't be affected at all by the extension. The only exception would be the establishment of new eparchies, a competence which eventually could temporarily be reserved to the Holy See or to previous pontifical agreement or consent. The next slide, please. Again, the more modest is the specific request, the better the chance of achieving a gradual extension of the patriarchal territory. For example, if it is for the whole Brasilia, it is more difficult. If it is for the federal state of Paraná, it's probably easier. But if, as a first step, it is only for the city of Curitiba and some other regions which has significant Greek Catholic communities, it could be difficult to find argument to refuse it. This initially minimal solution would pave the way for a more extensive expansion. Actually, the territory of churches sui juris could be extended to larger areas within a few years after both the Latin ordinaries involved in the Roman Curia would experience in practice that their fears about the negative consequences of this extension were not verified. The erection of the Eastern eparchies in diaspora was a more delicate issue, as it is affected directly the jurisdiction of the Latin diocesan bishops. If this difficult diocesan reorganization was possible to realize step by step, mainly thanks to the openness, pastoral attention, and perseverance of John Paul II, it is difficult to understand why the extension of patriarchal territory would meet with rigid rejection if this extension would involve only some of those areas where the Eastern eparchies already exist, and consequently, as I thought, the local Latin-Eastern relationship would not be affected at all by this change. Presumably, for all parties involved, Latin diocesan bishop, Eastern hierarchy, and last but not least, the scattered Eastern communities themselves would be a reassuring guarantee that the new situation emerging from the territorial extension would be, at least temporarily, properly regulated by specific statutes. The next slide, please. The future of the diaspora will depend less on the extension of the patriarchal territories than on two other urgent tasks. These are the thorough reform of the rules on the church through Eucharist membership, nowadays rather impractical as for the survival and reorganization of Eastern communities in diaspora on the one hand, and gaining or increasing the helpfulness of the Latin hierarchy to provide for pastoral care and support of the scattered Eastern communities in the West on the other hand. Adequately addressing the three tasks listed above, the reform of membership rules, mutual inter-church helpfulness, and the measured but adequate extension of territorial jurisdiction will significantly impact the future of the Eastern churches in the diaspora. If the first and especially the second task are ensured, the diaspora communities in the West will flourish even without the extension of the patriarchal territory. If the necessary progress will, however, not be soon achieved in the above-mentioned two areas, membership rules and helpfulness, the extension of higher jurisdiction will only have a minimal symbolic effect and will hardly help to protect the ritual identity of the scattered Eastern communities. In brief, the appropriate order of priority may prove to be vital in this area. The next slide, please. Some thoughts on the issues of regulating church sui juris membership. This set of norms can be traced back to the Age of Unions, and it starts from two basic conditions: a relative sociological stability and an adequate network of proper parochial coverage. None of them are given today in the Western diaspora. Moreover, the new preference for private autonomy, which is the case of the mixed marriage situation where parents are allowed to decide freely on the ritual membership of their children. Now, according to the experience in the Western diaspora, this possibility of free choice for various reasons almost always result in affiliation of the child by baptism into the Latin Church sui juris. Our present subtitle, however, requires not to complain, but to build mutual understanding, as recent final document of the Synod also advocates. For this, it is necessary to recall two fundamental preliminary facts that are in tension with each other: the irreplaceable value, the value of the Eastern traditions for the Catholicity on the one hand, and the tremendous sociological situation of the ancient Eastern Catholic churches on the other hand. In the light of the mass abandonment of the Eastern Rite in diaspora, some authors speak of ethnofugal phenomenon. If we sincerely strive to preserve the Eastern heritage, essential for the true Catholicity of the Church, then the law in force on Church sui juris membership must be revised as soon as possible and substantially, namely taking into account this serious unfavorable sociological situation. The next slide, please. In this area, in my opinion, the following principle can serve as a compass. Where there are sociologically unequals, only asymmetrical norms, to an appropriate extent supportive for the minorities, and their no less asymmetrical application, equally minority supportive, can guarantee substantial equality. This suggestion can easily cause resentment at first, as a first reaction. By this reason, it is important to consider this proposal in the light of the numbers. For example, the Syriac Catholic Church has less than 200,000 members altogether, and 60% of whom, as for our days, live scattered in the Western diaspora. Obviously, only a minor proportion of them is living in Syriac Latin Mixed Rite marriage. As some of them are not married, others are married with Eastern or with Protestant faithful, while others with unbaptized person. The next slide, please. Consequently, roughly less than, maybe the next, please. Yes. Consequently, roughly less than 1 in 10,000, or rather 1 in 12,000 Latin faithful marry a Syrian Catholic person. In the light of these statistic figures, were a norm that would require the ascription of their children without exception into the Syriac Catholic Church be indeed unacceptable, at first glance it would seem a radical asymmetry, but in the light of the statistical data, such a rule would mean an almost insignificant loss for the Latin Church. Finally, in this regard, it is important to remember that similar asymmetric rules on rite membership existed also in the past, as we know. The noticeable example of this sort of norms is the famous Constitution Etsi Pastoralis of Benedict XIV. These norms once served to facilitate the transition into the Latin Church, the transition of the Eastern faithful into the Latin Church. Similarly supportive rules along the lines of the new priorities seems to be urgently needed today to promote the survival of the fragile and scattered Eastern communities. The next slide, please. It seems to be obvious that the survival of the Eastern communities depends to a greater extent on the appropriate modification of these rules in favor of the Eastern Catholic churches than on the extension of the patriarchal territory, as I have just said. There have been written many studies on this topic of Church sui juris membership, but there are very few analyses guided by the above-mentioned principle of normative compensation of sociological disadvantages, to speak so, which in my view could be the only means to provide at least a partial redressing of the balance for the Eastern communities burned by increasing ethnofugal loss. Therefore, assuming the odium of self-referentiality, I would like to draw attention to some of my studies inspired by this principle. The next slide, please. Very briefly, the third topic. How can we try to promote Orthodox Eastern Catholic dialogue? Finally, in the third chapter, we briefly return to the topic of the ecclesiological model. Why the two features mentioned above, ecclesiological nature in the first chapter, ecclesiological nature and mutual independence are important elements. They are, however, insufficient for an authentic Eastern Church model. As we know, Orthodox doctrine doesn't accept the current figure of the Church sui juris as a possible framework or model for future unity. Here the question arises about the areas where the Catholic discipline can be made even more acceptable for the Orthodox experience or expectations. I would like to touch very briefly on three topics, which in my view are such promising areas. The first one, the fully local origin of power and the consequent stability of Eastern governmental autonomy. The second one, the Eastern compatible description of the Petrine office, and finally, a more synodal character of the future Eastern Code or common legislation. The first topic. One of the problems undoubtedly resides in the fact that in terms of origin, Eastern autonomy is still essentially dependent on the papal power, the pontifical power. It is not only subordinated to it, but it also depends on it for its very existence. Catholic acknowledgement of the sacramental or ontological component of the sacred power is a substantial advance in Catholic doctrine. The next slide, please. In Catholic doctrine, this doesn't, however, seems to be sufficient to ensure the adequate stability, the real stability of the Eastern governmental autonomy. Let me quote here in this regard an eloquent observation from Metropolitan Maximus Genopoulos of Salvia, one of the auxiliary bishops of His Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch. I quote a text from Maximus. It is clear that the Orthodox theologians should criticize the notion of missio canonica, for it does indeed imply a dependence of the sacramental power of the bishops on in papal power. End of the quotation. This further canonical or juridical determination through the hierarchical authority, the so-called missio canonica, as we know, is necessary to transform the ontological participation in the sacred function, the so-called numera, received by sacramental ordination, into a governmental power fully ready to act. Potestas expedita ad actum, according to the formulation of Nota Explicativa Previa II. This juridical determination, however, doesn't necessarily originate directly from the patron office, but can also be traced in the local church based on customary law or on a local legal order developed from such a customary source. The doctrine of Vatican II refers to this fact only narrowly, but the magisterial statement of John Paul II explicitly confirms this fact or this possibility. I quote, from the decree, he refers to the Orientalium of Unitatis Redintegratio 16. From the decree, there clearly emerged that the characteristic disciplinary autonomy which the Eastern churches enjoy, this is not the result of privileges granted, not a result of privileges granted by the Church of Rome, but of the law itself, which those churches have possessed since apostolic times. This alternative interpretation, recognized by Catholic doctrine but practically neglected so far, according to which governmental power is entirely, in its entirety, is of local origin or can be considered as local origin, including the extra-sacramental component as well, in my view, promise a further ecumenical convergence. In brief, according to this understanding, papal authority is not the source, not even partially, of the governmental power of Eastern hierarchs, and consequently of the autonomy of their churches. The only role the Pope has in this regard is to witness the authentic origin and exercise of this power and autonomy. As for the second topic, a more Eastern compatible understanding of the patron office, yesterday we have different interesting presentation. On this topic, I'd like to refer only to a proposal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, presided by Cardinal Ratzinger, requiring a truly Eastern-minded re-elaboration of the draft on the supreme authority of the future Eastern Code. Finally, it would be also helpful from ecumenical point of view if the common law for the Eastern churches would be promulgated not individually, only by the Pope, but in a more synodal manner, as it was demanded just during the codification, among others, by Cardinal Lubaczewski. In ensuring this synodal context, even the new Council of Patriarch or Council of Heads of the Sui Juris, envisaged by the final document of the Synod, would play an interesting role. Three very short conclusion, or three observations as conclusion. Two important features of the Church's Sui Juris Two important features of the Church's Sui Juris are their truly ecclesiastical nature on the one hand and the mutual canonical independence on the other, as we have seen. The latter characteristic is far from being an isolated opinion of a personal opinion, is a 60 years old, stable, fully accepted doctrine in canon law. Raising any new doubt about either of these two elements, as we have seen, would also result in a serious obstacle to ecumenical dialogue. The second observation. As for the mutual understanding between Latin and Eastern churches, the first and indispensable prerequisite or step for it, as it is obvious, is the precise identification of the problems, a comprehensive and common understanding of them. This aim requires a synodal attitude, listening and dialogue to understand the topic and the intentions of the interlocutor. Important topics from this field are the substantial reform of the norms on church sui juris membership and the gradual extension of the territory of the Eastern churches. In the case of the former, in accordance with the sociological needs, asymmetric solution seems to be the only reasonable line. As for the question of diaspora, gradual territorial extension seems to be preferred over universal personal jurisdiction. And finally, the achievement of an Eastern model more acceptable also to orthodoxy can be helped by several steps. The recognition and declaration, a new declaration of the entirely local origin of Eastern governmental power could be an important step in this regard. On the other, one another, no less important, would be the Eastern-inspired reformulation of the Patron office, even in the Eastern Code, as it was proposed by the CDF, as I referred. Finally, a synodal modality